At the gee pole was a man who steered in a manner familiar to Pentfield, and behind the sled walked two women. His glance returned to the man at the gee pole. It was Corry. Pentfield got on his feet and waited. He was glad that Lashka was with him. The meeting could not have come out better had he planned it, he thought. And as he waited, he wondered what they would say, what they would be able to say. As for himself, there was no need to say anything. The explaining was all on their side, and he was ready to listen to them. As they drew in abreast, Corry recognized him and halted the dogs. With a "Hello, old man," he held out his hand. Pentfield shook it, but without warmth or speech. By this time the two women had come up, and he noticed the second one was Dora Holmes. He doffed his fur cap, the flaps of which were flying, shook hands with her, and turned toward Mabel. She swayed forward, splendid and radiant, but faltered before his outstretched hand. He had intended to say, "How do you do, Mrs. Hutchinson?" but somehow the Mrs. Hutchinson had choked him, and all he managed to articulate was, "How do you do?" There was all the constraint and awkwardness in the situation he could have wished. Mabel betrayed the agitation appropriate to her position, while Dora, evidently brought along as some sort of peacemaker, was saying, "Why, what is the matter, Lawrence?" Before he could answer, Corry plucked him by the sleeve and drew him aside. "See here, old man, what's this mean?" Corry demanded in a low tone, indicating Lashka with his eyes. "I can hardly see, Corry, where you can have any concern in the matter," Pentfield answered mockingly. But Corry drove straight to the point. "What is that squaw doing on your sled? A nasty job you've given me to explain all this away. I only hope it can be explained away. Who is she? Whose squaw is she?" Then Lawrence Pentfield delivered his stroke, and he delivered it with a certain calm elation of spirit that seemed somewhat to compensate for the wrong that had been done him. "She is my squaw," he said. "Mrs. Pentfield, if you please." Corry Hutchinson gasped, and Pentfield left him and returned to the two women. Mabel, with a worried expression on her face, seemed holding herself aloof. He turned to Dora and asked quite genially, as though all the world was sunshine, "How did you stand the trip, anyway? Have any trouble to sleep warm? And how did Mrs. Hutchinson stand it?" he asked next, his eyes on Mabel. "Oh, you dear ninny!" Dora cried, throwing her arms around him and hugging him. "Then you saw it too! I thought something was the matter, you were acting so strangely." I hardly understand," he stammered. "It was corrected in the next day's paper," Dora chattered on. "We did not dream you would see it. All the other papers had it correctly, and of course the one miserable paper was the very one you saw." "Wait a moment. What do you mean?" Pentfield demanded, a sudden fear at his heart, for he felt himself on the verge of a great gulf. But Dora swept volubly on. "Why, when it became known that Mabel and I were going to Klondike every other week, said that when we were gone it would be lovely on Murden Avenue, meaning, of course, lonely. Then—" "I am Mrs. Hutchinson," Dora answered, "and you thought it was Mabel all the time." "Precisely the way of it," Pentfield replied slowly. "But I can see now. The reporter got the names mixed. The Seattle and Portland paper copied." He stood silently for a minute. Mabel's face was turned toward him again, and he could see the glow of expectancy in it. Corry was deeply interested in the ragged toe of one of his moccasins, while Dora was stealing sidelong glances at the immobile face of Lashka sitting on the sled. Lawrence Pentfield stared straight out before him into a dreary future, through the gray vistas of which he saw himself riding on a sled behind running dogs with lame Lashka by his side. Then he spoke, quite simply, looking Mabel in the eyes. "I am very sorry. I did not dream of it. I thought you had married Corry. That is Mrs. Pentfield sitting on the sled over there." Mabel Holmes turned weakly toward her sister, as though all the fatigue of her great journey had suddenly descended on her. Dora caught her around the waist. Corry Hutchinson was still occupied with his moccasins. Pentfield glanced quickly from face to face, then turned to his sled. "Can't stop here all day with Pete's baby waiting," he said to Lashka. The long whiplash hissed out. The dogs sprang against the breastbands, and the sled lurched and jerked ahead. "Oh, I say, Corry," Pentfield called back, "you'd better occupy the old cabin. It's not been used for some time. I've built a new one on the hill." End of The Faith of Men by Jack London. Recording by Robert Scott, June the 26th, 2007.